So our first talk today is Alex Hidalgo, who is the Associate Professor of Latin American History at Texas Christian University, where he's taught since 2013. His book, Trail of Footprints, A History of Indigenous Maps from Viceregal Mexico, explores the commission, circulation, and use of indigenous maps from colonial Mexico, with special focus on a corpus of 60 mostly unpublished maps from Oaxaca. I particularly like the chapter that's all about the dyes, because that's just the kind of guy I am. He has edited issues of journals, issues of the journals Ethnohistory and the journal Latin American Geography. He's a member of the Andrew Mellon Society of Fellows in Critical Bibliography, as well as the Grolier Club and Conference on Latin American History. And I made sure to have that in there because I think it speaks to that community of collectors, bibliographers, and academics. His book in progress is titled Mexican Soundscapes of the Colonial Era, and I imagine based on the title of his talk, this is coming out of that project. So his talk is Urban Sound Maps of Colonial Mexico. So please welcome Alex.
Can everybody hear me okay? Oh, wonderful. Excellent. Thank you. Good morning to all. I am absolutely delighted to be here with you. I should start by sharing that my very first visit to the Newberry was almost 20 years ago in 2006. I was a first-year PhD student at the University of Arizona, and I took advantage of one of these consortium grants that the Newberry offers, and I came in particular because there was a presentation by the renowned scholar of indigenous maps, Barbara Mundy, and it was my first introduction to her, and she was so generous that she spent an hour with me talking about this map that I had found in the archive that I had no idea what to do with. And so I'm very grateful to be with all of you here today. Dave, thank you so much for inviting me to form part of these lectures this weekend. So John Harley, the influential 20th century historian of cartography, posited that silences abounded in early modern mapmaking. In a widely cited article from Imago Mundi, the field's leading journal, Harley made the then radical proposition that unseen political forces shape purposeful and accidental omissions on maps. At the very time maps were being transformed by mathematical techniques, he wrote, they were also being appropriated as an intellectual weapon of the state system. Harley used the idea of silence to explain absence, of data compilation, the limits of knowledge, technological constraints, and the destruction of evidence. It's not surprising Harley used a sonic metaphor, in this case the complete absence of sound, to think about cartographic production. Maps, he argued, engage both the imagination and the social preconceptions of their readers. But what if we were to amplify Harley's ideas? Turn those silences into sonic elements? Is it possible to think about a map's acoustic properties? What is the relationship between map making, sound, and space? My talk this morning seeks to draft a preliminary sketch of the opportunities and challenges thinking about sound may represent for historians of cartography, ethnohistorians, and scholars of the early modern era who can not access machine recordings of the societies they study. Sound defines space, which in turn shape maps. My study will center on a 17th century plan of the city of Mexico, drawing insight from locally made maps and paintings, as well as written sources including town council minutes, ecclesiastical records, and imperial policies. The representation of grids, use of churches to define places, and the depiction of plazas are essential cartographic elements rooted equally in sound as they are in sight. Early modern cities were loud places defined by a variety of technologies of sound used to mark time, establish boundaries, make announcements, and celebrate rituals. By thinking about the relationship between maps and sound, I propose that they played a key role in shaping ideas about space and place. An urban sound map typically refers to an interactive digital map that includes recorded sounds from that environment that users can access. Recordings are often accompanied by data, including images of locations and textual descriptions to supplement sound. Sound maps most commonly track noise, but they also document nature and human-made sounds. They can amplify geographic spaces, including forests, rivers, and waterfalls, human settlements, including towns and cities, and also divisions within urban environments across the world. The city's in-memory global sound map, for instance, does just that. It offers a collection of over 7,000 field recordings from across 130 countries, including a range of sound of various parts of Mexico. The definition I've just presented, however, leaves little space to help us to consider the acoustic properties of early modern maps, those made prior to mechanical recording practices of the late 19th century. The work of architectural historian Emily Thompson, however, offers interesting possibilities. In 2002, Thompson published The Soundscape of Modernity, Architectural Acoustics and the Culture of Listening in America, a study that analyzes the way architects and engineers managed and controlled sound in large indoor spaces during a period with rising noise levels. An extension of this research resulted in the interactive website, The Roaring Twenties. The project catalogs over 600 noise complaints from 1933 and plots them on a historic map of New York City. Made the same year as the complaints, the 7-square-foot map serves as a visual reminder of the detailed distribution of the 5 boroughs. By adding new plot points to the surface of the map, Thompson transformed an urban layout into a sonic reconstruction of the city, complete with photographs, documents, and Fox Movietone newsreels that provided the acoustic elements which amplified the map. Thompson's Roaring Twenties project provides a nice blueprint to consider the relationship between historical cartography and sound. But how else might it be possible to amplify an early map? Early European maps, especially those tied to Atlantic exploration, often displayed various layers of sound that drew from a pilot's experience with navigation. Consider Sebastian Münster's Typus Orbis Universalis, made in 1554. The loudest element on this map, if it isn't already evident to you, are the 12 windheads that frame the map's border. Windheads did not merely represent cardinal directions. They reminded users of the sensorial expertise required to navigate treacherous waters that shaped early modern cartography. Spanish cosmographer Pedro de Medina's Arte de Navegar, published in Valladolid in 1545 and translated multiple times into French, Dutch, Italian, and English, provided a handbook for navigators and cosmographers that reminds us of the ways sound informs sailing and knowledge production. To identify storms, for instance, Medina instructed navigators while on land to pay attention to the summits and the forests and the jungles, in order to listen for the sound of the wind. If the wind could not be felt or heard beyond the forest, it meant a windstorm approached. This invisible force that moves air and gases through the Earth's surface empowered the vessels that sailed across the Atlantic could be perceived through acoustic means to understand weather patterns. Susurration, the uninterrupted flow of water when the ocean is calm, produces a distinctive sound that navigators also tracked to identify changes in climate. If the sea appears calm, Medina warned, that it makes a noise from within, it means strong winds. In another of Munster's maps, this one of America made in 1545, he evokes susurration using short, curved lines that appear in groupings across the page. We can also hear the ship sailing across the water because of the distinct splashing of water against its wooden frame. Susurration offered temporary calm while navigating the vastness of the ocean, but when winds howled, thunder rumbled, and waves violently crashed against a ship, the sense of dread must have struck at the hearts of crew and passengers alike. Not surprisingly, the vastness of the oceans indeed covered the surface not just of the Earth, but of the maps that represented it. Other examples are even louder. Mercator and Hondius's 1607 map of America offers the viewer the susurration of water, but they have added a decorative cartouche with a toucan and a parrot at the top, the latter captivating Europeans for its sound-making qualities, in particular, the bird's ability to mimic human speech. Inside the frame, the indigenous man on the farthest left plays a flute for the rest to hear, while a fire in the center heats a large pot, presumably of human remains. Even the aquatic animal at the very top reminds us that sea creatures, including blue humpback and sperm whales and bottlenose and Atlantic spotted dolphins, often surfaced making big splashes. When they did surface, blowing air created a powerful and distinctive sound that alerted mariners of potential danger. Medina warned, for instance, that when dolphins are skipping across the ocean and you can see them on top of the waves, it is a sign of a storm that will approach from the direction in which they came from. The use of windheads, depictions of water and susurration, and images of sea creatures and indigenous inhabitants of the Americas form part of an acoustic ecology of early exploration, a process that exposed navigators to strange, beautiful, and terrifying sounds that the new continent offered. When evaluated through a sonic dimension, it appears to me maps of early exploration are a rather melancholic group, objects that revealed uncertainty, danger, and the solitude of the sea, records reflective of the hours and days spent listening to the gentle swooshing of water only to be awoken by the squawks, whistles, gurgles, and thrills of parrots and toucans. Would it make a difference in our ability to detect sound in maps if we examined a smaller portion of space, say an urban plan of a large early modern city? Consider Juan Gomez de Trasmontes' 1628 map of Mexico City, the capital of the Viceroyalty of New Spain, a vast jurisdiction encompassing North and Central America, as well as the Philippines. Trasmonte, a Spanish architect involved in the construction of several important religious buildings, including the Mexico City and Puebla cathedrals, oriented the map eastward, offering a bird's eye view of the city. The traza the urban grid pattern institutionalized for colonizers in the royal ordinances for the laying out of towns shows evenly divided rectilinear streets with churches and convents dominating the area. Canals cut across each part of the city, making water a significant feature of the urban landscape. The city has various wooded areas and is surrounded by farmland and water. A legend on the top emphasizes the city's most important buildings and landmarks, including the Royal Palace, the Cathedral, the Town Council building, University, and the public park known as the Alameda. A list of missionary complexes associated with the Franciscan, Augustinian, Dominican, Jesuit, Mercedarian, and Carmelite orders, as well as nunneries, hospitals, parishes, and schools. Trasmonte made the map in 1628 during a period when authorities studied ways to drain Lake Texcoco. It's possible Trasmonte produced it to inform an appraisal of the city's infrastructure to calculate the tax needed to pay for the drainage project of the lake. Along with this map, Trasmonte produced views of Acapulco, Veracruz, and the well-known plan and elevation of the city of Mexico, which I will show in a minute, to provide defensive options for the two port cities and a resolution to the flooding dilemma that the city faced. Moving forward, I wanted to mention a few issues associated with the lives of these maps. The Vingbum map, which is the one that I am analyzing for our top, is a highly mediated image. Priscilla Connolly and Roberto Meyer, who have studied the map in detail, have advanced the following hypothesis on the origins of this map. That the original drawings made by Trasmonte in New Spain were shipped to Spain on the 1628 fleet headed back to the Iberian Peninsula. They suggest that the Dutch pirate, Piet Hein, took control of the maps when he seized the fleet on September 8th of that year. After the drawings arrived in Amsterdam, painter David Wicboons was commissioned to make a large oil painting from them sometime between 1628 and 1632. The paintings can be traced from this moment until their eventual destruction during the bombing of Middelburg in 1940. Further, the paintings served as models for the watercolors made by Johannes Wicboons, the person who is cited on the slides, David's son, sometime in the 1650s or 1660s, one of which is the copy that I examine here today. The handful of surviving copies made by Wicboons are scattered across archives in Florence, Rome, Paris, and for a very, very short time, the map fair of our own Nebenzahl Lectures at the Newberry. During yesterday's event, Laurie Cohen and Allison Petretti from Orator Galleries shared with me that one of Wicboons' surviving copies would be gracing us with its presence here today. The shriek that I made when I found out echoed so loudly in the room yesterday, I was sure David was going to kick me out of the event. In any case, as a scholar with varied interests in maps and their lives, I'm delighted to participate in an event that brings together dealers, researchers, and enthusiasts to think about the future of these rare records. That's the copy that Orator has brought that you should all take a look at later in the day. Art historian Barbara Mundy has suggested maps of colonial Mexico present to us utopian visions of the capital needed to make sense of the complex urban environments that defined their creation. If Trasmonte's map is a utopian vision of the city, what is the image obscured? What's missing? For one thing, the city appears to have been flooded when Trasmonte made the map. A legend in Spanish on the top portion indicates the city had about 10,000 vecinos, or Spaniards with rights and responsibilities, as well as 9,000 indigenous households, and the majority of those indigenous households were at the time inundated. The other important component the map obscures centers on the presence of the city's inhabitants. While the flood killed a significant portion of the population, the city was not entirely devoid of life. Spaniards, Nahuas, indigenous people from other regions, mixed race groups, foreigners, and religious minorities all form part of the city's diverse population. Yet nowhere in the beautifully illustrated map of the city do we see humans in action, or even animals roaming, flying, or floating across the landscape. We are left with a mute and silent, empty space of the sounds characteristic of any urban environment. Art historian Michael Gaudio proposes some visual images, invite us to listen to them, to not only see but hear what they have to say. He suggests non-acoustic objects such as maps and paintings can often evoke an imagined experience of sound. Trasmonte's map does just that. Its focus on the urban grid and the grid's principal components helps us imagine the way sound influenced the city in its political, social, economic, and cultural priorities. The urban grid implemented by Spanish colonists in the Americas incorporated specific elements that contributed to the production of sound and the emergence of new sound technologies. The plaza, the central square that brought together the buildings of church and state, as well as the residences of the most distinguished citizens, served as a significant sound mark, an area of the city where the concentration of sound was the loudest. Bells and human voices define the plaza's acoustic dimensions, allowing us to develop, identify, classify, and historicize the uses of sound that guided social behavior. Let me explain. Plazas were at the heart of any town or city in Spanish America. To get a sense of an average plaza, think about a football field, a space that measures 360 by 160 feet as a good point of comparison. Guidelines for Spanish colonists in the Americas called out for plazas to conform to a city's population and potential growth. Mexico City architects designed the Plaza Mayor to measure 787 feet by 639, the largest of its kind in the Americas. The guidelines further instructed colonists to incorporate smaller plazas at various intervals along the city so that churches could be built to support religious instruction. Besides the Plaza Mayor, Trasmonte's map documents another 4 plazas. One small plaza described as Placita, adjacent to the Plaza Mayor, also known as the Plaza del Volador. One near the southern causeway known as La Piedad, the Plaza of Santiago Tlatelolco in the north, and another small plaza nearby. Ordinances also required noisy and smelly trades, including butchers and tanners, to settle on the outskirts of town. On the map, we see this principle at play. Notice that the slaughterhouse and butchers appear on the edge of the city near the San Antonio Causeway in the south. Churches and convents lined Mexico City's urban grid. A key feature of these religious buildings was their use of bells, large iron-made ringing devices that produced one of the loudest sounds that a person from the period could hear. bells represented the most significant change to the Valley of Mexico's acoustic ecology after the arrival of Spaniards in the 16th century. The ringing of bells structured the elements of everyday life more than any other early modern device. Bells called people to mass and other celebrations, alerted people of danger, and delivered good news. As Alan Corbin observes for the 19th century French countryside, bells imparted a rhythm to the ordinary functioning of the community. Missionaries required bells in churches to summon and announce. During the religious construction boom of the 16th century, Iberian metalworkers, weaponsmiths, and manufacturers of gunpowder already in the Americas transitioned to casting bells. According to Toribio de Benavente, one of the first friars to arrive after the fall of the Triple Alliance, indigenous people also cast some good bells of very good sound. This is one of the trades they excelled in, he said. By the mid-16th century, dozens of churches throughout the city rang their bells to make announcements as an audible feature of the religious buildings that colonists and missionaries helped establish in places beyond the Valley of Mexico. The use of bells extends beyond the capital. Indigenous painters documented this technology of sound on countless land grants from the Valley of Mexico and surrounding areas. Indeed, their appearance, individual of church structures that represent a town, speaks volumes of their importance to everyday life. The 1603 map of Santa Maria Nativitas and San Antonio from the state of Hidalgo, for instance, documents two transformations. The most evident is the use of a grid to divide space. The second is the presence of two large churches that anchor the top and bottom of the page. The mapmaker took care not simply to depict each building, but ensured that each had a bell, an important cartographic distinction that often spoke to the political relationship between towns. Consider the 1591 map of Cuantitlan and San Miguel Tultepec from the neighboring state of Mexico. Besides the large church that anchors the map on the bottom right corner, three other churches dot the map. In this case, the largest church in the corner, representing Cuantitlan, is the only one with a bell because of its head town status. The smaller churches without bells represent subject towns. Not every religious establishment enjoyed the prestige of owning a bell. Casting bells cost large sums of money, and they required time to complete and a specialized structure sturdy enough to support their size and weight when installed. The church, observes historian María del Carmen Carrión Nieto, used bells as their voice, a tool to announce their presence and to attract divine protection. One instance in which civil and religious authorities used bells was to seek protection from climate disasters. Let's listen into what religious authorities in the city of Oaxaca in the southwestern part of New Spain had to say when in 1666 they dedicated their new bell. And this is not the bell, by the way, that they dedicated, but it's contemporaneous. I also wanted to point out very quickly that from these two slides, I've included the weights of the bells. Consider the differences in size between that one weighs 6 tons and that one, which is considerably lighter. So the dedication good. Yeah, that's good. Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. So the dedication went something like this. For many years to this day, this city has suffered great losses and fear from repeated lightning and thunderstorms, which have caused sudden deaths and a notable disturbance of emotions from those who live here. We have made supplications and prayers with processions and solemn masses to Christ our Lord and the glorious patron, Saint Martial, so that God bestows virtue on this principal bell, Santa Maria. We have consecrated and dedicated this bell today so that storms flee at its sound, as well as the demon that disturbed the clouds, and to stop the continuous earthquakes of this land. The powerful sound of the bell served for more than simply keeping time. It functioned as a reminder of God's power on earth. Because of this, civil and religious authorities developed guidelines and policies designed to both monitor and coordinate the tolling of bells. Officials of the Archbishopric of Mexico, Spain's highest ecclesiastical authority, mandated that sacristans in the cathedral and in all other cities, villas, and places under the archbishopric and province should ring the bells in triplet, 9 strikes with an interval after the sun has set, when it starts to get dark. The instruction further noted that when the cathedral bell ringer sounds the bells, all the other sacristans of all the other churches and monasteries should respond with haste. I've included in this image circles in part because I feel that acoustic resonance is part of what we're hearing here. The one in the center is the largest because it had the largest and heaviest bell, which produced the deepest sound, and the one that traveled the farthest. I don't know if this is falling again. So, okay, I think that might be good. Yes. This type of legislation formed one customary practice by which, as Neil Atkinson has pointed out for Renaissance Florence, authorities grounded their presence over the city by giving oral form to both important and quotidian events. In some cases, city council members used the ringing of bells to regulate unwanted behavior. In 1537, the city's residents suffered an outbreak of violence and theft as a result of a sheriff who refused to patrol the streets at night. Officials agreed that for the people's safety, a curfew would go into effect at 9 every evening instead of the customary 10 o'clock. Bells, they instructed, should ring for 30 minutes to allow individuals to return home. Those found on the streets after hours would have their weapons confiscated and could face imprisonment. Through the bells, authorities had the ability not simply to make announcements, but to convey a range of emotions, including happiness, sadness, and fear. Figure this out. I think I got it. Okay. I wanted to return to the subject of plazas I discussed earlier in my presentation. Because of their centrality to urban life, plazas generated other important forms of sound, including the cacophony of weekly markets and ritual celebrations, daily and celebratory masses, processions, and public sentencing trials. The state deployed other technologies of sound in these spaces to make their presence known, including trumpets, bugles and drums, fireworks, musket volleys, and religious choirs. Ironically, Spanish colonialism relied on a ubiquitous figure whose sole purpose was to emit vocal announcements, the pregonero, or town crier. A chief mediator between authorities and the residents of a town or city, criers institutionalized imperial policies as well as regulations developed and implemented by local town councils. They did so through pregones, public notifications or proclamations of important mandates and information, trumpeting, the vocal modulations used by town criers to get attention and deliver announcements of various kinds, depended on more than a person's ability to speak to crowds in a loud voice. As Gustavo Illades Aguiar observes, the performative aspect of the proclamations helped distinguish between the different forms of information conveyed to the public. The social ear, he proposes, would have enjoyed a refinement difficult to imagine today. By simply listening to the town crier's vocal inflections, merchants and clients of this or that market could anticipate the general nature of the announcement. Pregoneros communicated with the city's residents about policies that regulated commerce, public administration, land, agriculture, social behavior, rituals, and infrastructure. In the Iberian world, no policy went into effect until a town crier proclaimed it in public for everyone to hear. In the case of Mexico City, town council minutes helped to detail with precision the importance of criers in disseminating information. As the public arm of the Cabildo, pregoneros operated in the most densely populated outdoor spaces, such as markets and plazas, so that proclamations could reach the widest audience. The Plaza Mayor, which you see on the slides, served as the city's principal venue for announcements, but a town crier's work was spatially motivated. Criers often moved through plazas to trumpet a proclamation several times for maximum exposure. For instance, on September 1st, 1552, Hernando Diaz announced on the corner of Tacuba and again on the corner of the Plaza Mayor that intersected with St. Augustine Street, the regulations for selling food products. Sometimes criers disseminated information outside of the cathedral as congregants left Mass, and sometimes they stood in front of the entrance to the audiencia, the viceroyalty's main judicial body. On other occasions, criers made announcements in specific locations related to certain groups. On the corner, at the intersection where the nut vendors who sell cacao live, for example, or underneath the marquee of the merchants, especially when the policies announced pertain to these groups. Pregoneros often walked the streets broadcasting information, especially prior to feast days, when criers instructed residents to sweep in front of their houses and to make shared public space attracted for the feast day celebration. No matter where the pregoneros communicated information, witnesses and a scribe who verified proclamations always loomed in the background taking note. In this way, the plaza and the interconnecting streets imagined by urban designers functioned as routes for disseminating essential information through specific administrative agents and in specific oral and written form. These examples document the complexities of the utopian city represented in maps, as well as the need for authorities to communicate effectively with the people. In another respect, they point to the importance that historical actors placed on listening to and producing sound. Sound theorist Murray Schafer's assertion that listening gave way to seeing as a result of the printing press and Renaissance art is correct if one considers the movement of time from afar. But when examined up close, the work of town criers reveals the deeply intertwined worlds of hearing, sight, and writing. The Cabildo records that inform this section of my work represent one example of this. A crier's voice served as the key conduit between authorities and the populace. Trumpeting shaped the urban experience by centering vocal modulations as the principal method for delivering information. In response, the city's populace learned to listen. Singing formed an important part of the city's plazas and public spaces. Indigenous singers performed in Mexico City in confraternity processions, feast day celebrations, theatrical performances, marriages, and burials, along other occasions. Consider the folding screen with Indian wedding and flying pole made in 1690. Known in Spanish as biombo, this luxury item with origins in Spain's early modern global trade with Asia possesses spatial and acoustic qualities that help document our sound map of colonial Mexico. Made of 4 panels that extend 10 feet in length and 5 in height, the folding screen depicts 2 interrelated subjects: the wedding of an indigenous couple according to Christian rites, and a Nahua dance and celebration known as a mitote. The artist or atelier responsible for the biombo depicted idyllic scenes of people and places that sought to capture the unique cultural milieu of central Mexico. Key features represented in the panels starting from the right include the celebration of the Christian sacrament of marriage, the Nahua dance known as mitote in the center, ritual pole flyers and a man on his back tossing a log with his legs in the far left. In each case, the use of color, the styling of clothing, and the presence of people of all ages and ethnicities suggests the diverse nature of congregations in public spaces such as plazas. While the scenes described in this biombo were tied to a town in the valley, the celebrations were not unlike those that took place regularly in the city. Besides the plazas, the Alameda, a public park established at the end of the 16th century, was an important sound mark represented on the map. The Alameda hosted musicians and poets who regularly performed for crowds of people that visited that outdoor space. Men and women used the park in various ways. The city's elites displayed their wealth by strolling through the smooth walkways among the white poplar trees planted in 1593 when construction of the park began. In the folding screen, or biombo from 1676, we see the Alameda in use with people resting on benches, men riding horses, and couples engaged in conversation. Trasmontes' city plan indicates the Alameda designers divided the rectangular space into 4 quadrants with a decorative fountain in the center. The fountain represented an important congregation point of the public space. In his account of his visit to Mexico City, Gemelli Carreri noted that all of the entertainment takes place next to a fountain. Children, servants, merchants and Spanish women and men can be seen gathered near the fountain in the 1676 biombo. Besides flooding, Trasmontes' map obscured the challenges of governing the metropolis. Uprisings in 1611, 1612, 1624, 1692, and 1697 challenged authorities to confront the shortcomings of colonial rule, generated expenses and mistrust, and ultimately led to stricter regulations that guided behavior. The riots of 1611 and 1612, those connected to African conspiracies, fueled racial strife. Civil unrest further permeated the city from 1608 to 1612, along with fears of back rebellion in 1665 and more threats in 96 and 1701. public sentencing trials known as autos de fe, well-orchestrated rituals of power organized by the Holy Office of the Inquisition, reached their height during the middle part of that century. The public trials of 1646, 47, 48, and 59 sought to demonstrate the power of the state and appease peninsular authorities, persecute religious minorities, and curb certain illicit activities. While many accounts of the autos de fe exist in published form, visual representations of them are much rare. An example from one that took place near the city in 1716 helps us to think about the way spatial priorities ordered the staging of plazas during this and other important civic and religious events. We can observe an elaborate stage and dozens of people distributed throughout. A table in the top center displays several crosses, a book, and other religious ornaments. A legend on the upper left-hand side indicates the cleric who celebrated the Mass, an ecclesiastical judge, seated by himself in a special part of the stage towards the left, the alcalde mayor, the sheriff, the corregidor, the prelates who attended, and a party of indigenous governors seated towards the left, displaying their staffs of office. In the center of the image, we observe 6 figures: the condemned, 4 men and 2 women, dressed in penitential garb. Dozens of onlookers witnessed the proceedings, listening intently to the crier trumpeting announcements and reading the transgressions of the condemned aloud for everyone to hear. Staging plazas to accommodate celebrations and other events required considerable organization and skill. During discussions about preparing festivities, town council minutes regularly referenced the tablados, or platforms, required to stage dances, theatrical plays, and musical performances. As inconspicuous as these makeshift structures appear, the tablado functioned as an essential material component of the acoustic environment. Stages and seating were assembled through the use of hammering and banging. They produced their own creaking, squeaking, and cracking noises when the wood contracted and shifted as it came into contact with people and the elements. And they physically supported those who acted, sung, prayed, or played an instrument, as well as those who laughed, cried, gasped, shouted, whispered, and applauded. I'd like to leave you with one short case study of the plaza, suggestive of the way space, urban design, and sound shape visual culture. Recurring flooding in the 1690s devastated the region's crops around the city. The city, in turn, experienced severe food shortages, which led to conflicts over access to grain and its prices. Prior to things coming to a head in the summer of 1692, when the city's marginalized revolted against viceregal authorities, reports suggested one could listen to people's frustrations. It was heard during this time, a voice among the populace that attributed the violent weather, the destruction of the fields, and the flooding of the canals to divine punishment for past celebrations, observed Carlos de Sigüenza y Góngora, one of the city's most notable intellectuals. Sigüenza y Góngora detailed accounts of the rebellion that relied on listening and oral experiences to explain the events leading up to the riot. In the interest of time, I'm going to fast forward for the last part of what Sigüenza y Góngora is recognizing. What is most notable about the incident is the way shouting, a loud call or cry that typically expresses a strong emotion, allowed the marginalized to dominate the plaza. On the night of June 8, 1692, people's frustrations reached a boiling point after a woman lost her life when haggling for prices with grain merchants. Sigüenza y Góngora observed that the crowd roared, "Death to the viceroy and all who defend him! Death to the Spaniards who eat our corn," as they stormed the viceregal palace. The cries embodied the sentiments of thousands of natives, blacks, and mixed-race people who protested over the elevated cost of wheat and corn and the government's failure to supply adequate foodstuffs. Nahua women, he wrote, rallied the masses in their own language, shouting, "Go to war with joy, and isn't this our land?" The deafening crack of stones against the palace wall, combined with the yelling of the angry mob, he said, sounded like 100 drums of war. Bells rang furiously throughout the city to warn of danger and bring together the militia, but few came, and when they arrived, they had no weapons or munitions. A small delegation led by the archbishop headed to the plaza to try to defuse the situation, but the group's prayers evaporated at the onslaught of angry cries and stones that descended upon them when they reached their destination. You could see in the top portion of this image the palace wall destroyed because of the stones that were cast during this description that Sigüenza y Góngora is writing about. And even though this image was made several years after the incident, clearly the material remains of the incident played a very important role in defining this space. In conclusion, I want to close by noting that maps help us understand the way sonic legislation was embedded into urban design practices. Though I recognize not every map can be easily read for acoustic content. The plaza, churches, and bells represented the most important sound mark in Mexico City, and I would argue across towns and cities throughout Spanish America. Authorities grounded their authority in these practices through town criers, ringing of various kinds of bells, fireworks, and musical instruments. Civic and religious rituals, including processions, masses, and autos de fe, forced individuals to live this space collectively, to share in its maintenance, to understand it in ways that are not always evident to us. In the absence of detailed maps in the city from this time period, I suggest ways paintings and screenfolds can help us create a fuller picture of the city, its spatial arrangements, and especially the sounds that animated daily life. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It was a wonderful talk. One question that's come in by text is how, what evidence you found or how you think the installation of bells and the tolling of bells was received by Indigenous and American Indian people in, California, what's now California, New Mexico, Arizona, that kind of, if there was a difference between how the tolling of bells was experienced there versus in Mexico, and how that played into their kind of laboring lives.
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I would say that I want to think about that in two ways. So the experience in the Spanish borderlands, especially in the northern part of the Spanish borderlands, is a very distinct experience from what we have in Mexico City. And I think the best way to illustrate that is by recalling this map in particular. When I developed this particular map, I was looking at the legend, and what I've done is I've circled all of the religious buildings that are highlighted in the map. I don't know if they all had bells. It's possible some of them didn't. What I found in the records is that bells would often get damaged, and so institutions would go for a while without having a bell until they can find the appropriate person to either repair it or until they could raise the funds to repair it, which was an expensive endeavor. But consider this urban space here, and even if some of these places are not ringing bells, we have a large cacophony of sound that emanates from the center and then spreads to the different types of churches. This is not the case in the Spanish frontier. On the Spanish frontier, you have a church, a mission church, you have a settlement, and then presumably there is nothing else around. So that echo that is happening in the urban space is not part of that. However, the bells in churches and mission churches in the Southwest function in the very same way. They call people to masses, they alert individuals to danger, all of the kind of traditional things. One of the things that I appreciate about the Spanish Empire is that they are very consistent in their policies, even if they adjust these policies to fit local conditions.
I'm scared of the microphone now. Alex, thank you. That was so beautiful and interesting. Like, you're really opening up so many things. I have a very quick suggestion and a question. The suggestion is, this made me think of when you showed Munster, it made me think of the Ptolemaic distinction between geography and chorography, where he says geography is the body and chorography is the eye or the ear. And you have that beautiful woodcut with the eye and the ear and the connection between the two, right? He doesn't say the lips or the mouth or whatever. So the ear is already there. I thought that would be nice to put in here. The question for you is, you started with that reference to Harley and the maps being silent. And then you brought in all this wonderful evidence that sort of allowed you to get at the soundscape. And I wanted to ask you if you could reflect on how the sources are louder or quieter. Like, what is this relationship between maps and paintings? I guess I just feel there's an opportunity to examine what a map does versus what a painting does, and how they both relate to your interest in sort of reawakening sound. Is there a reason why paintings are louder than maps?
Yeah, thank you, Daniela. Thank you very much. I appreciate your suggestion on the first part of your intervention. And then thinking about the difference between the two visual mediums is an important one, and I admit that I don't have all the answers yet. I think that maybe the best way that I can explain how I've been thinking, at least very superficially and simply, is I've been thinking about these maps as going from large, global to specific, so global to local, which is why I started with the Munster maps and these kind of large choreographical pieces, move into a plan, which in many ways really, if one is being quite ironic, does not necessarily invite us to think about sound. But because of the way that I've thought about the regulations that were implemented by Spanish authorities to construct these spaces, because of the example that I gave about the Roaring Twenties map, it has made me think about how space is distributed. Paintings, I feel, I guess the way that I envision that in my mind is like when we go to Google Maps, right? And we have that huge map of the world, and then we start clicking and pressing that plus sign to make it bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger until we get the largest part. I see the paintings functioning as that. If we're coming in with that plus sign to enlarge and magnify this map, what I feel that we wind up finding are these paintings in the plazas, in the different spaces of the city, how the people are moving throughout. I know that there is a larger theoretical explanation that I will formulate at some point, but I don't quite have it yet. Thank you. If I'm here to choose, I'm not exactly, there we go.
I got the mic. Okay. Quick comment and a question.
Yes.
I was in Mexico City just a few weeks ago, and in the Zocalo, the Plaza Mayor, and the they have their independence celebration in September, and they were exactly taking down the temporary platform that they had built in the plaza. So didn't get the perfect photo because there were all these logistics people with their trucks moving, but it's exactly the way you described 350 years later that, you know, temporary platforms are built for special events. My question is related to the location of the plazas and the cathedrals in various cities. In Mexico City, it displaced the Templo Mayor, the indigenous religious center, also Tlatelolco, similar situation, indigenous temple there, destroyed, the rocks used to build a church and a large plaza adjacent. You talked about Spanish, you know, their rules and their plans for these cities. And I just want to know your insight in the relationship between the location of the church and the cathedral and these temples that were destroyed or displaced.
Sure. What I know about the subject is that it was common for colonists who went into areas that had been settled and had religious precincts tied to Mesoamerican religions. It was common to go into those spaces, destroy those temples, use the materials to build churches, sometimes on top of the sites where the old temples were built, sometimes adjacent to them. So I'm not surprised to see that in the city of Mexico, and I'm not surprised to see it in other parts of Mesoamerica. In one of the regions where I did research in Oaxaca for my first book, there's evidence of relief sculpture from temples made prior to the arrival of Spaniards, embedded into the architecture of Christian churches in spaces that are hard to reach, hard to take down. So they're very purposeful in ways of resisting or ways of embedding elements of indigenous culture in this very complex moment of change and contact.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much, Alex. This was really a fascinating sharing of your work. I learned a lot today, so thank you for that too. And one of the ideas that you presented us with, the idea of bells as amplifiers of the voice of the church, really struck me as bringing me home because, of course, is the dimension of power of the church in the lives of people, whether you want to hear or not. You have to hear it, right? But I would like to simply make a little connection with my work because you draw the connection between sound and text, right? And it's so amazing to see in the colonial documents how when there's an important royal decree, an edict that needs to be distributed to the towns, so the pregonero, the town crier, is ordered to sing it or pronounce it 3 times, for example, right? He has to do it. But the scribe, the one who is crafting the document, in fact, writes 3 times verbatim the same announcement. So it's one of those things where sound and text are really connected, right? So that's fascinating. But my real idea here is to suggest another layer of connection between sound and coloniality or colonial rule. This is particularly based on documentation from the Andes, right? And it has to do with what about if we use bell sounds as measure of territory? Why do I say this? Because in the documentation about land disputes, for example, in the Andes, sorry, I'm not a specialist in Mexico, there is this adamant legal interpretation of how much of the land is communal land of the pueblo. And there's always this standard, it's 1 league, una legua. How do you measure it? From the center of the town, from the plaza, from the church, right? 1 league around. Anything beyond that, the indigenous peoples cannot claim. And why is that? Because they estimated that the sound of the bell of the chapel would just be heard 1 league around. So that's what the courts used as a measurement of how much land can the indigenous pueblo claim. Beyond that, nothing. But it's the bells, it's the sound of the bell that extends to a certain extension. I don't know, it may vary according to region, but there is just 1 league. So I just thought about that, and I thought, okay, sound can serve so many purposes, right? Even legal purposes. That's my little.
Thank you very much for that comment, Alcira. I appreciate it very much. And you're right about the circumference and the way that sound travels. And I think that it creates these distinct acoustic communities that are very much tied to their neighborhoods, and more so in ways than they are to the entire city.
We'll do one.
You're done? Okay. Thank you, Alex. It was just a beautifully presented talk, beautifully illustrated, so clear, as is typical of all of your talks, so thank you. I have a methodological question. And in art history, we often use the representation. We read the representation, like the map, against an embodied or phenomenological experience, how it feels to be in this space. And we have certain kind of methods that we use. Scale is a way that we register kind of embodied or phenomenological importance in the representation. Color and placement is another way. You're doing something very methodologically adventurous and difficult. And I'm wondering, what do you see as those kind of modes of translation that allow one to move from the experiential nature of sound, very particular and embodied, and then what we see in the representation? How do you translate the representation back to the embodied experience?
I think the written documents is the answer to that, without a doubt. And I had mentioned to you in our conversation over the last couple of days, or yesterday perhaps, that I have many, many examples. I had to choose what to include, what not to include. The project that I'm working on is not exclusively about maps and sound, but about sound really, and I'm in many ways attempting to bring my interest in maps to bear with this idea of sound. But I think that the primary sources themselves are the ones that speak to these spaces. And I believe that there is more work to be done, and that this could, in fact, turn into a much larger sort of thing. I envision it at some point as a kind of homologous project to the Roaring Twenties, where it can display primary sources, in fact, recordings. There are recordings of music that was used during the colonial period. There are recordings of colonial bells in churches today. So there are ways to incorporate all that and to further amplify the map. But you're right, I wouldn't necessarily call it adventurous. I would call it foolish in some ways. This is a difficult task, but I have been able to think about the themes that I'm examining in a much more expansive way. I'm thinking about Alcida's comment now about how far that sound travels and about whether, if I were more technically skilled, what these circles would be doing right now is that they would be reverberating constantly to emulate the sound of the bells, and that if I were really technically skilled, that that would cover the equivalent of what they would have actually covered in the urban space of 17th century Mexico City.
All right, let's thank Alex.
Thank you.